All right, hello again, economics students. We're continuing thinking about how the government intervenes in the free and competitive market to correct a market failure. In this video, we're going to look at indirect taxes and laws or rules and regulations. Indirect taxes are often called excise taxes, and they work the opposite way to a subsidy. So a subsidy is a payment to producers, so it will affect the supply curve. A tax is levied on producers, which means they have to pay the government. So the opposite. Okay, so taxes, indirect taxes, and subsidies always affect the supply curve first. And because they're opposite, they are going to increase the cost of production for firms. And this will mean that they will be less willing and able to produce at each price. There'll be a shift in the supply curve to the left because it'll be less profitable for them. So let's have a look at the demand and have a look on the demand and supply curve. So if we've got a market here for, let's call it fuel, a market for fuel, because in Australia we have an excise tax on fuel. A big chunk of the petrol price that you pay, about 44 cents, is fuel, a fuel excise tax. Okay, so when the government levies this tax on fuel producers or fuel sellers, what they're really trying to do is to shift the supply curve to the left. So they're trying to shift the market supply for fuel to the left. And in doing that, in shifting the supply curve to the left, they're trying to have suppliers account for the social costs. They're trying to make them internalize the social costs. Once they do that, they're going to produce less. If they have to pay for the costs on the environment of the emissions from fuel, well, they'll produce less. So they're shifting the curve to the left. Now, we could say that this will increase the price, but I think that's actually just a little bit confusing. Because remember, when the supply curve shifts, what we're really looking at is what happens to resources down here. And my pen keeps disappearing. But if the supply curve shifts to the left, then there'll be less production and consumption. So we'll call that quantity traded, less quantity traded of fuel. Okay, so allocating resources away from the production and consumption of fuel because it has a negative externality. Okay, some other examples that they would use and that they do use in Australia is there are alcohol taxes, there are sugar taxes, there was once a carbon tax, and these are all examples of negative externalities that the government is trying to correct, trying to create an efficient outcome. Okay. Let's have a look at regulations and laws. Now, these come in many different shapes and sizes, but it's basically when the government enforces or imposes some rules on a particular market that's going to correct a failure and achieve an efficient outcome. So I think it's best to have a look at some examples. So the first one here is a Victoria fishing guide. If you're a person that goes fishing, you will have seen one of these before. They're very important. It tells you if you want to go out into the bay and go fishing, it tells you the rules around what fish you're allowed to catch, the kind of species, how big they are, how many of each fish you're allowed to actually take home. And what that's trying to do is enforce some protections on our common access resources, our fish. Okay, so we're trying to account for the future need for fish. So we're going to protect species so they can breed and grow and we have enough for the future. Some for now and for the future. So that's our intertemporal efficiency. The second one here is a roadworthy certificate, and this is really trying to correct the failure of asymmetric information. Remember, we had a look at the market for buying a car, or even if you were going and getting an assessment from a mechanic. What we're trying to do here is if you're trying to buy a new car, we're trying to correct the imbalance of information. So the government sets rules around if you want to sell a second-hand car in Australia, you need to get a roadworthy certificate from a mechanic, and that mechanic will give you an independent assessment of all the problems with that car and check whether it's actually roadworthy. So what that does is reduce the imbalance between the seller of a second car and the buyer of a second-hand car. Okay. Finally, the packaging and labeling laws in Australia. Remember, we talked about if you're buying like free-range eggs or gluten-free things, how do you actually know that what the marketing says is true? Well, if you want to sell food in Australia, you have to abide by this very strict packaging rules, and you'll look at the back of any product and they'll have the same setup for labeling, and it tells you exactly what's in that particular product. Again, it's the government correcting the asymmetric information failure, trying to give consumers more information so they can make good, optimal decisions and create an efficient outcome. There's another example where we'll do advertising in the next video. All right, bye for now.